So for those of y'all who are guests today and maybe used to us being in the Union Church and me whistling, Stan Kabinka said, Barbara, go over there and get Clarabelle's.
Oh, Clarabelle.
So this, for those of y'all also who don't know who Clarabelle Snodgrass was, she was renowned in the Historical Commission. So much of what got accomplished early on, she was recognized at not just county level but state level. She was quite dynamic. And she lived till 102, Julius? Where are you? 102?
Yeah.
So I think this is great that she calls us to order, certainly in spirit and everything else. It's better than me sticking my fingers in my mouth and whistling. I call this meeting to order. It's 12:05. I welcome all of y'all, and we start out normally by asking our guests to stand and just tell us your name. And I'll start over here. If you're a guest, these are faces I've seen many times. Sheila's application's already in, so why don't you stand up, young man, Austin?
Hello, my name is Austin Long. I am the educator over at Fort Martin Scott now. I worked with Christopher for about a year and a half over at McKavett, so just here to support.
Austin helped us this summer with our living history camp, and so when he came in and relaxed, today's his day off.
Yes, man.
But this summer he was in full regalia of his uniform and everything.
1850s.
Yeah, so we
that
in
wool, was rough.
in wool, you know, helping kids. So we were happy about that. Okay, let's start over here. No, please.
Go ahead. I'm Julie Centel, and I'm interested in Fort McKavett because Kat was a volunteer many long years ago.
Yeah, and I was with Old Stories and New Voices. I know Cody very well, and so I got her interested in and love this place. Just love it.
And do you want to tell your name?
Yes, I volunteered out here for many years and was part of the Old Stories New Voices cultural youth camp that they had out there. And you and I went out there one time. We did. Yeah, and so when Julie sent this to me, I said, "Oh boy, it's gonna be on like Old Home Week to see Fort McKavett." So that's why I'm here.
Arthur, would you like to introduce yourself?
Me?
Yes.
Ed Wallace, and I've been out there to Fort McKavett, and I saw the notice in the paper, and I haven't been there in years, and I'd like to hear the whole presentation again. And I'm past president of Riverside Nature Center and helped build this thing.
We're grateful to that, Ed, and still supports so many causes, symphony, and everything else. Okay, the next row.
I'm Lou King from here in Kerrville. I'm Christopher's grandfather, so I'm here.
Oh, I love that. I love that. It's all going to be good, Christopher.
Don and Janet Dugart, we live in Hunt, lived there full time for about 13 years. Had our place for almost 30 years, and been coming up to Hill Country way before that. And we've been to many, if not most, of the historical sites in Texas. I have a hunting lease out not too far from this, and you passed this a whole bunch of times, but it's one of the forts that I haven't been to. So I have a lot of interest in coming to. So thanks for putting this on.
Well, hopefully this will inspire you then to go, oh, we have new folks coming. Hey, Jane. Okay, I'm putting you on the spot immediately. Jane, you want to introduce yourself?
My
And
name is Jane King, and this is my husband Lou, and this is my dear, dear friend of high school last year. Beverly Sawyer, and I'm really gonna embarrass him, but this is my grandson.
well, I
know,
grandfather did, and I didn't put that connected when Lou introduced himself. Well, we're really happy that you've got family here. We've darkened the lights. I hope that's okay, but we've done that so this shows up. And so, Christopher, I hope you're going to be able to see your notes and everything.
Yes,
ma'am. Okay?
ma'am.
All right. Please, if you have a cell phone, cut those off right now because we don't want any interruptions. I always have to be reminded of that. Meanwhile, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Christopher. He's the lead military interpreter for the Historic Sites Division of the Texas Historical Commission. He advises and he assists the military sites of THC regarding on-site interpretation and education programming. Christopher earned his master's in public history from St. Mary's University in San Antonio. Prior to working for THC, he served as the O'Connor Chair Graduate Research Assistant at St. Mary's from 2021 to 2024. So he is new in this job. We're just so glad that he made time. Obviously, you're working hard out there, and what a great site and great place to work. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Like she said, my name is Christopher Hohmann, and I am the lead interpreter for the Historic Sites Division, or the lead military interpreter for the Historic Sites Division of the Texas Historical Commission. I am based out of Fort McKavett, and much of the work that I've undertaken over the last year and a half has been based around the history and now the archaeology of Fort McKavett. So we'll start with the basic timeline of the federal occupation of the fort. So Fort McKavett was founded in March of 1852. It, in about the next 2 to 4 years, a construction campaign was undertaken at the fort by the soldiers themselves, who were responsible for quarrying the stone and doing all the kind of heavy lifting work. Most of them were not really soldiers at all in this phase of the fort's construction. They were more day laborers, and they were not particularly happy about that situation. By 1853, you had the completion of 5 stone barracks around the parade ground, the main parade ground, which you guys will see in a couple of maps here in a few minutes. In 1859, though, the government made the decision, because of the advancing frontier line prior to the Civil War, to abandon Fort McKavett in March of 1859. So the first federal occupation really only represents about 7 years of the fort's history. But then the Civil War kicks off, and the Native American tribes, some of which we will discuss here shortly, are able to actually push back the line of Texas frontier settlement farther east for the first and only time in Texas history. And so that meant that when the war was over, and all the dust had settled, and the battles were over, and federal troops returned to Texas, they found that they had to reoccupy and rebuild a lot of the posts that they had deemed to be unnecessary in the 1850s, and that included Fort McKavett. So in April of 1868, the 4th Cavalry arrived on the scene and began to rebuild the post. And this second federal occupation of the fort lasted for about 15 years. During that time, there were major construction campaigns, some of which we will talk about later. But Fort McKavett's military history, its history of federal occupation, ended finally in June of 1883 as the railroad and the advancement of things like telegraph and commerce into west central Texas really made Fort McKavett once again unnecessary. So before Fort McKavett, so there is a history of this country that dates back to before the United States, before the federal government, and before even the colonists who colonized Jamestown and the eastern seaboard and pushed farther west in the 18th and 19th century. The first people that occupied the area around Fort McKavett, what would become Fort McKavett, were the Hohmannos. They had traveled from the Rio Grande Valley, and they were following their game into west central Texas, and they did not have horses. So these people would have been traveling on foot. Unlike some of the tribes that we will discuss here momentarily, they were traveling completely on foot. The next big tribe, and you can see this gentleman here, were the Lipan Apache or Lipan Apache. The Lipan Apache really occupied the area around Fort McKavett well into the 17th and 18th century, and they were some of the first tribes in the region to successfully adopt the horse for hunting, making war, and their other activities. However, by the 1700s, the Lipan Apache were actually absorbed by other Apache tribes, and they were falling into contention with a tribe I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with, the Comanche, and the various bands of the Comanche, like the Penataka Comanche, which roamed around Fort McKavett, or the area that would become Fort McKavett in the 1760s and 1770s. It got so bad at one point that the Lipan Apache asked for help from the Spanish government to protect them from the Comanche. So by the time that we're talking about the establishment of Fort McKavett, which is the 1850s, the Comanche were really the most dominant tribe in the region, and they were probably also the most formidable tribe in the region as well. So federal forts in Texas. So we have these kind of coalescing factors, right? The existence of Native American tribes like the Comanche in these regions of Texas that will necessitate the construction of lines of forts once Texas is annexed by the United States in 1845 and upon the conclusion of the Mexican War in 1848. Fort McKavett was established as part of that second federal frontier line. It was one of 22 federal posts in Texas in 1852. It was established along the Upper El Paso Road because another element to this story of why Fort McKavett was established was not just the presence of Native American tribes, it was also the fact that the country itself was expanding on that almost inexorable path towards manifest destiny in the 1850s, all the way up until the end of the 1800s, right? So you have Anglo-American settlers who are moving farther and farther west, not just in Texas, but they're also moving to California to take advantage of the California gold rush. So Fort McKavett is established along the Upper El Paso Road to guard that traffic. It is also established along the Comanche War Trail to keep an eye on the Comanche who traversed that region and lived on and off in that region. And it is also established to help protect the growing settlements here in Texas, at least prior to the Civil War. And if y'all can see, Fort McKavett is right here, this red triangle here, but there were also other forts, Fort Mason, Fort Tarrant, which is in modern day Kimball County, Fort Duncan all the way at Eagle Pass. So it was just one in a line of frontier forts of the federal government trying to maintain and protect their new acquisition in Texas, if you will. So Fort McKavett in the 1850s. So Fort McKavett was really a very, very rudimentary place in the 1850s. The barracks that were completed in 1853, 5 stone barracks, which you guys can actually see along this section of the parade ground. This is a map of Fort McKavett in 1853. And these 5 buildings here, northeast, north, and northwest, were the soldiers' barracks that they themselves completed and built. Each of these structures were about 80 by 20, so they were quite large. However, they didn't have any floors, and they didn't have any doors, and they didn't have any windows. So, you look at this map here and you're saying, well, if they built all that in a year, well, that's impressive. Well, they don't have any windows, they don't have any dirt floors, and they don't have any doors. So, not quite the comfortable living. The other thing that I'll point out here, because it's relevant to the archaeological section of the presentation, is that on the opposite side of the parade ground, this is facing north, the barracks are facing north, and in the south, you have the construction of very rudimentary officers' quarters for your lieutenants and first lieutenants and captains who were really in charge of the regiment and overseeing the construction of the post, but they lived in what were essentially one-room kitchens. And this is the early 1850s, this is 1853, and so they're literally living in what we would probably consider for most of us to be like our living room. That was the extent of officers' quarters at Fort McKavett. The big luxury, I suppose, was that they were able to sleep away from the enlisted men who had to sleep together in their squad rooms and bunks that slept 2 men on top and 2 men on bottom for a grand total of 4. And so this is Fort McKavett in 1853, and I'll go behind the podium so you can see Fort McKavett in 1857. So this map is oriented actually kind of the opposite direction. North is facing this way, south is facing that way. East and west are facing this way. So the north here, you again see our 5 barracks that were there in 1853, but now you start to see the completion of more complex officers' quarters in the shape of L's. You'll also see the completion of, or the beginning of a new officers' quarters right up here on kind of the left-hand side of this map. That would eventually develop into the commanding officers' quarters, which is really one of our most famous structures and was completed in about 1858 or 1859. So Fort McKavett, like I said earlier, was abandoned in 1859, but the Army returns to the fort in 1868, and really the period from 1868 to 1875 is the major construction campaign for the fort after the Civil War, and it is also where we, as a historic site today, get most of the buildings. So most of the buildings that we have on site either took their current shape or were outright built in the 1860s and 1870s. So, whoops, I knocked off. So this map on the left here would have been Fort McKavett as it appeared to the soldiers of the 4th Cavalry in spring of 1868. You guys can see most of these barracks lie in ruins. This little kind of drawings that kind of look like tents or trees are the soldiers who are actually living under canvas during this time because they've arrived on the scene and the fort is so dilapidated and so kind of uninhabitable that they are the ones who now have to reconstruct the fort. And if you look here, 1875, 1876, you can see the completion of new officers' quarters for our lieutenants, a whole new row of officers' quarters to the east part of the post, which were intended for captains, these buildings here. And then, of course, the restoration of most of the barracks that were there in some shape or form in the 1850s. And this barracks right here, barracks number 3, is actually a combination of 3 of the barracks that had existed in 1853. So the Army comes back and they say, okay, we're going to combine these 3 barracks into a single barracks and make it really the longest military building west of the Mississippi in the 1870s. So really 1875 to 1876 is the height of the fort, both in terms of the construction that was done, as well as in terms of the occupation by soldiers. So at this point in the 1870s, there were about 400 to 600 soldiers staying at Fort McKavett on a daily basis, and that doesn't include the civilian communities that popped up around the fort and the civilians who relied on Fort McKavett for their living or for school or whatever nature that they were there for. So at one point, you can imagine a community that approached 1,000 people in total. But all good things must come to an end. And by the 1880s, most federal planners are kind of starting to see the writing on the wall. The railroad is going to cut through Texas. The telegraph is going to link Texas and various parts of Texas with other parts of the country. And unfortunately, Fort McKavett did not get a railroad. They did get a telegraph, but they did not get a railroad. And so that meant that by 1883, Fort McKavett was really no longer considered necessary, and it was abandoned in June of that year for the final time. At that time, there were approximately 40 structures still standing in the final inventory of buildings, but this is not the end of Fort McKavett's story. After the Army, and this has bearing on the archaeological work that they did eventually when they became a park, but the town of Fort McKavett basically took root in the old fort's buildings pretty much as soon as the Army left. All the people who had lived around the post, relied on the post, kind of lived in the area, they said, we're going to go live in those buildings because a lot of these buildings were actually better built than where they were living previously. And thus the town of Fort McKavett was born. At its height, the town in about 1920 to 1930 had about 150 to 200 residents. They used buildings like the hospital here as private residences. This is a family actually living on the porch. This photo taken in 1884. This is a picture of the town in about 1917. Many of these buildings, like I said, became private residences, they became businesses, and they became schools. And so the people who lived in these buildings, they took good enough care of the hospital, Lieutenant's Row, Captain's Row, that now we have 19 total structures that we take care of because they helped preserve a lot of those structures fully intact. Quite a rare story. This is also a picture of a gas station in 1960, actually owned by one of the more prominent families in the Junction area, and just kind of a funny contrast between the modern 20th century world and the old world of the frontier and Manifest Destiny. This is Fort McKavett in about 1930. You can see here that there are a few families. The Ball residence is the hospital, which is where our offices are now. And the Beale residence is OQ number 8, which we'll actually get kind of a closer look at here. But it was a map, again, people living in these buildings, people going to school in the schoolhouse, all the way up until 1968. Which brings us to the archaeology of Fort McKavett. So Fort McKavett is part of an initiative by the state to basically create all of these state historical parks in about 1967. Now, eventually, they're going to have to found what they call the Fort McKavett Restoration Incorporated, which is kind of charged itself with buying the buildings from the town residents in the 1960s. And they will gradually acquire these buildings all the way up until about 1973. But the archaeological goals are really shaped by the fact that the state of Texas said, we recognize the importance of Fort McKavett as a frontier fort, right? The kind of archaeological work that they undertook was about restoring the buildings to their prior appearance, 1875 appearance. It was about tracing wall lines, locating doors, identifying architectural features that would help us better understand, here's how these buildings have changed over time, right? Can we identify what part of the buildings was 1850s, what part of the building was 1870s, and what part of the building has been adapted or changed as a result of the town era occupation by the townspeople. And so a lot of the work that they did was not necessarily your deeply destructive archaeological work that could sometimes characterize other sites. A lot of it was, can we document these structures architecturally? Can we figure out what they're supposed to be used for in the military era? Can we figure out how they've changed over time? How can we make that work? As a state historic site, how can we make it all work? And these pictures here were taken in 1969 as part of the first archaeological investigation. They are here uncovering the original flagpole location of Fort McKavett's flagpole. So they tried to find it by old-fashioned methods, and then they asked the townspeople, and they kind of found it in a roundabout sort of way because the townspeople were like, you need to go look over here, and they did. And they were able to find one of the guide wires, and the guide wires led them to the actual location of the flagpole hole. And this is them uncovering the actual location, and this over here is him pointing at one of the guide wires. And the guide wires are actually original to the flagpole. So tools and methodology. So a lot of the archaeological work that they did was very much building-centric, right? There was a lot of intact buildings that they had to go into and sift for artifacts and determine what portion of the building was 1850s, what portion of the building was 1870s, what portion of the building was altered during the town era. And so what they often did is that they would divide these buildings into units, right? And each unit would be basically a place for archaeological tools and instruments and would represent where they would actually start looking for these artifacts. And this picture over here is the actual picture that was done of the location of the original flagpole over here. This is officers' quarters number 8, and this is officers' quarters number 13. For structures that were in ruins, things went kind of a little differently. The first thing they would have done for structures that were in ruins would they would have used things like rakes, hoes, and other instruments to basically do vegetation clearing. And then once the vegetation was cleared, they would go in there, they would trace the lines of the ruins, they would try to locate the doors, and they would basically determine what areas of ruined buildings were hotspots for potential artifacts. So this is the artifacts themselves. It's important to kind of note, again, Fort McKavett has been acquired by the state of Texas to be a kind of callback to a different era, a callback to the era of Army occupation. So many of the artifacts that really caught the attention of archaeologists were military in nature or dated to the military era from 1852 to 1853. Some of these examples here are a scale board. So in the 1850s, a metal scale board would have been worn on a soldier's basically coat, kind of on your shoulder. And if you were an enlisted dragoon, for example, and you were part of the 2nd Dragoons, you would have worn the kind of brass scale board that you see on the far left. This button here was a 2nd Dragoons button dating to about the 1851 military uniform regulations. During this period, each branch of the military had its own designations on its buttons. So D for dragoons, I for infantry, C for cavalry eventually in the 1850s and the mid-1850s. And these are infantry buttons dating from that exact same period. These on the second half of this slide are those structures that really are artifacts that really dated to the military era, but they couldn't say for sure that they were military in nature. They weren't military buttons. They weren't cartridge boxes. They weren't epaulets. But they did date to the right time period. So this would have been a fully intact wine bottle that was discovered in the 1970s. This here, it's a little hard to see, but the button was actually a button with a locomotive on it. And then here would have been ceramics, right? So the civilian use of ceramic plates, ceramic items for civilian use. They found a lot of ceramics that were not fully intact, but in pieces. It is important to note here that if through about 1978 to 1990, they recovered about 400 military or military-era artifacts. That represents only about 1% of the archaeological artifact findings of the archaeological work from 1978 to 1990. So really, not a whole lot of stuff to find. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is in this last slide. So challenges, considerations, and limitations. So something to kind of keep in mind is we are kind of blessed and cursed with the town era at Fort McKavett. The people of Fort McKavett helped preserve the buildings, but it also meant that their own trash, their own lives were represented materially in the material culture of the site. And there were many, many instances in which they couldn't quite tell, these archaeologists, okay, is this town era? Is this military era? We can't really tell. We can't say for sure. The other thing that is important to kind of note about the town era is that at one point, the collection of military era artifacts and military artifacts was basically a cottage industry. So you have a lot of townspeople who basically created their own private collections, and we got a chance to look at them, but they're not actually part of the State Historic Sites collection today. And that is because the townspeople basically came through and they were living in the buildings and they found stuff as they went along, and they kept a lot of the archaeological findings and artifact findings in their private collection. So it really limited for Fort McKavett what could be found and what could be interpreted for the use of the site. The other thing to keep in mind here is that Fort McKavett was really the work done here was primarily architectural in nature. It was not deeply destructive archaeology to find the deep, really good stuff. It was mostly about tracing wall lines, finding doors, identifying features so that the buildings could be restored, so that they could be adapted for park use to their 1875 appearance. So that really limited the number of military and military artifacts that could be found at the site from about 1969 all the way to 1990. That is not to say they did not accomplish a great deal, and one of the things that they did accomplish is kind of pictured here, is one of the big excavations they did undertake was for our officers' quarters number 10, which was rebuilt completely from the ground up on the original foundation in 1990 as kind of a culmination of a lot of the archaeological work that had been done in the 20 years since 1969. And that is one of the only structures that has actually been rebuilt on site. Most of the other buildings you'll see, if and when you come to Fort McKavett, are in fact original to Fort McKavett itself. And these pictures here are them kind of taking pictures of the ruins over here. And then over there, you'll actually see TPWD officials kind of working through the reconstruction of officers' quarters number 10. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Were there many women there?
There may not have been many women, but the women that were there were conspicuous. These frontier posts were notoriously isolated, and it was just the reality that there weren't going to be a lot of people there, period. And the women that were there, they would have been laundresses. Some of them may have been officers' wives. A lot of officers' wives would go with their husbands on these frontier posts. In fact, officers' wives are some of the best recorders of more of the social and cultural world of military posts of this era. But there would not have been that many of them. Those that were there were certainly very conspicuous and very important to the day-to-day running of the fort, whether that be laundry, domestic service, or if you're an officer's wife, entertaining other officers' wives, entertaining the guests at the post, especially your Colonel McKenzie's and your Abner Doubledays and your W.T. Sherman, who was out here for a little bit in 1870 or 1871. So yes, there would have been women, probably not a whole lot, but they would have had a very conspicuous presence on post.
I remember reading Elizabeth Custer's book, Boots and Saddles, and I was surprised that she had gone with him every place. So you've described very much of what her life was like, but I didn't know much about Fort McKavett's women.
Yes, ma'am. So like I said, but there were also a lot of women who stayed home, right? There were women who, these women, they were high class. They were from the big cities, Philadelphia, New York, Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. They were used to a certain kind of way of life. And for a lot of women, they found adventure in that. Custer, Lydia Lane, who was the wife of Lieutenant William Lane, who was at Fort Inge, which was another Texas fort of the 1850s, went with her husband. But there were also probably some women who stayed behind because it was just such a different world, such a different life. So there was probably a good balance of both. Yes, ma'am.
What was the highest ranking officer at Fort McKavett? Was it usually a captain?
It would have depended on exactly the era or the time, the year. So at one point, he didn't command the post, but General Sherman did pay a visit to the post. He was at that time the leader of the entire U.S. Army, coming down here to Texas to see how bad things were. And he found out they were pretty bad. But there would have also been a Colonel McKenzie, Colonel Ranald McKenzie. He was actually the one who really helped kick off the post-Civil War reconstruction of the fort in 1869 to about 1871. But then there might have also been at times like Captain Hugh A. Feaker, who he was the last commander of Fort McKavett, and his soldiers lowered the garrison flag at noon on the 30th of June in 1883 when the fort was abandoned by federal soldiers for the final time. So it would have been kind of a mix of colonels, lieutenant colonels, some captains, really depending on what units were in the area, who was garrisoned where, and whether or not those people may have been on detached service. So like Mackenzie, he was in all over the place. Like he was technically supposed to be at Fort McKavett, but he was also in Washington, D.C. on some army boards doing some work for the army. So he may not have been there even though he was supposed to be. So it would have depended on who was supposed to be garrisoned there and whether or not those soldiers were on detached duty or doing service elsewhere. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned having to buy back the quarters from the townspeople after they had the town era. But when they moved in, did they just take it over? They didn't buy it from the federal government. They just kind of moved in when it was abandoned?
The townspeople?
Yes.
So that's actually a great question. So the land on which Fort McKavett is located, was leased by the Robinson family, Joshua D. Robinson and his wife. And in 1883, the Robinsons still held the lease, and the lease went up, and the Robinson family decided, okay, we have this whole plot of land, and the entire military reservation was 1,600 acres, right? The heart of the fort, which makes up our historic site, is only about 90 acres. The entire reservation was 1,600, and so they said, we are going to sell each of these buildings as individual plots. We are going to sell off, OQ8, Officers Quarters 8, as its own house. We are going to sell off the schoolhouse as its own kind of entity. So that was the decision that they made in 1883. And as the townspeople kind of move into the buildings, they are buying them from the Robinson family.
The Robinson family didn't lease, they owned that.
Yeah, they leased it to the federal government, and they own the land. Yes, sir.
Military activity.
So the military activity of the 1850s was relatively limited. There were about 3 units at Fort McKavett. The 8th Infantry, which established the fort in March of 1852. The 2nd Dragoons, which arrived in November of 1853 and stayed as kind of the regimental headquarters until about 1855. And then the 1st Infantry, which would have been from about 1855 to 1859. But of this era, the 1850s, we know very little about the military actions, campaigns that were undertaken, because most of our records from the 1850s have been lost to time. After or during the Civil War, when Fort McKavett was briefly occupied from 1861 to 1862, a lot of the Confederates burned a lot of our records. And that meant that our understanding of the campaigns that the soldiers would have gone on, especially since the Dragoons were really the first mounted regiment in this part of Texas during this era and could keep up with the mounted tribes like the Comanche, it means that our understanding of those are relatively limited. From the 1860s and 1870s, you get far more information. So, for example, soldiers from Fort McKavett were part of the column that participated in the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. That is not to say that the soldiers came from Fort McKavett to Palo Duro Canyon, but they would have gone most likely from Fort McKavett to Fort Concho, or from Fort McKavett to Fort Concho to Fort Griffin, and then they would have kind of converged on the Texas Panhandle as a part of that campaign. And of course, that campaign was the last great campaign by the federal government, by the Army, against tribes in Texas from 1874 to 1875. Yes, sir.
Water, running water, stream, what did they have available to them at the fort?
Yes, sir. So they would have gotten their water from several springs that fed the post, one of which we still have on our property today. Basically, what they would have done was that soldiers assigned to that task on a daily basis would have gone down there twice a day to one of the springs, which flowed all year long with pretty healthy water. It was a little bit kind of limey and alkaline-y, but pretty healthy on balance. And they would have gotten water every morning and every evening, packed it away in water wagons, and brought it to the post for distribution, most likely in barrels that are just inside the buildings or just outside of the buildings. But the water was a huge reason, and the fact that it was running water, it was healthy water from the springs, was a huge reason why they chose to establish Fort McKavett where they did. And it was a huge part of why Fort McKavett was as healthy as it was. You know, a lot of these posts, and you read about posts like Fort Phantom Hill and others that were abandoned, in Fort Tarrant, which is in Kimball County, and they're just not very good places to live health-wise. Fort McKavett was not one of those places, and the water was a big part of why. Yes, sir.
Just a follow-up question. You mentioned infantry, dragoons. What's the differentiation? You have infantry, dragoons. What does dragoons mean?
Sure. So the dragoons were a mounted regiment. They were trained to fight both on hand and on foot. And they were, at the time of their operation in Texas from about 1849 to 1855, they were the only mounted regiment in the entire state of Texas. And the infantry would have been your soldiers who were marching on the ground. And then your cavalry would come after the dragoons. The distinction between cavalry and dragoons is a little bit difficult to work out, but the dragoons would have been trained to fight both on horse and on foot, and the cavalry would have probably been primarily trained to fight on foot, or on horse, excuse me. Yes, sir.
Is there any military cemetery there?
Yes, sir. So there is a Fort McKavett cemetery. It is no longer part of our property. It is still open to the public. And most of the soldiers who were buried in that cemetery were moved to San Antonio when the government began to erect the national cemetery system in the late 19th century and early 20th century. There are still a handful of unmarked and unidentified soldiers' remains in the cemetery, but where, we don't know. And again, as we're talking about how sometimes the military era and the civilian era kind of bleed into each other and impact each other, it is now also a civilian cemetery. So a lot of the families who lived at Fort McKavett or lived in the region around Fort McKavett are buried out there as well. And so it's no longer just a military cemetery. It is a cemetery for the surrounding community. Yes, ma'am.
Last question, Buffalo Soldier Association with Fort McKavett.
Yes, absolutely. So the Buffalo Soldiers, all elements of all four regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers post-1869 were garrisoned at Fort McKavett. The 9th Cavalry, 10th Cavalry, 24th Infantry, and 25th Infantry all had various different companies of soldiers that were living at Fort McKavett. In fact, the very first Buffalo Soldier to receive the Medal of Honor, Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz, actually was recommended for and performed his Medal of Honor action while he was living at Fort McKavett in May of 1870 as part of the skirmish of Kickapoo Springs. So yes, we've had all four regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers. In fact, the 24th Infantry was created on the grounds at Fort McKavett, a combination between the 38th and 41st Infantry regiments that was consolidated into the 25th Infantry or 24th Infantry Regiment in 1869 at Fort McKavett. Yes, sir.
Menard what's the interaction of Menard and Fort McKavett? I don't know when Menard was established, so.
I'm not 100% sure when Menard was established either. I want to say it was 1871. They definitely would have relied on Fort McKavett for protection. And even today, Fort McKavett's story is a huge part of the story of Menard County. Many of the people who live in modern-day Menard or who have lived in modern-day Menard have connections to family who may have lived at Fort McKavett at some point as well. And they're still a big supporter of our programs, and they always boost us on social media. But the historical connection between the two, I'm sure it's there. I'm sure that the Army provided a level of protection during the 1870s, but I can't speak to that too much. Yes, ma'am.
I have a flagpole question. Was the flagpole the first construction that the military did when they were establishing a post?
So I can't speak to the order in which the flagpole, can't speak to the order. What I can say is that all of these posts had kind of a similar outlay, right? Like there was a central parade ground, and around that parade ground, would have been officers' quarters on one end and enlisted men's barracks on the other. And usually at the center of that parade ground would have been a flagpole. None of the reports that I have read for this presentation or others indicate when the flagpole was originally constructed. Just that if you look at the maps themselves, you can see the flagpole is there. So I can't speak to when that flagpole was built, but neither can any of the sources that I've read.
Well, Christopher, this has been fantastic.
Thank you.
It's been a long time since I've been there, and I'm inspired to go back. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
To his grandparents, you should be very proud.
I am very proud. I'm going to, you know that,
One thing we're gonna do, you're welcome to stay. We're gonna have a short business meeting. For those of you, y'all can pass these down both ways, just because I'm not gonna have the minutes up. Because we're here, you can pass some of these around if you didn't get it.
oh, okay.
So we'll do a short business meeting. I want to just really give a shout out to Patricia Poor. For those of y'all, Patricia White back there, I meant to say this last month. She's taken on the duty of getting the programs together. So last month with Ryan was really great. Bunny Bond is really the brains behind this organization, and she really runs things. But that was one thing Bunny was doing, and I said, let's divide and conquer a little bit. And Patricia has stepped in, and I'm so grateful. The programs have been great. So y'all have Patricia to thank for that. We brainstorm about it, but she does the hard work. What I'd like you to do with the paper you got, take some time and just quickly read through the minutes. I'm going to be quiet and let y'all do that. It gets sent out, so I'm hoping y'all read it on your email, but if you do not, you have those minutes. I do know there's, no, that's later, sorry. No corrections that I can find. Thank y'all for coming. Thank you. So are there any corrections, any changes, any input from the membership? Thank you, Bill. Can I have a second?
Second it.
All right, then those minutes will be filed as is and moving along on our meeting. How many of y'all received Bunny's great information piece on our 50 years? That came in. She did such a good job on kind of tracking some of the wonderful things that have been done in the last 50 years. I'm really grateful she did that. We're going to officially celebrate that in November. November, we have a meeting. We're going to have a Thanksgiving potluck after the presentation by Lonza Teague. She's going to talk to us about the upcoming Smithsonian Sparks of Innovation exhibit that will be at KACC in May. But we are going to celebrate in November because we do not have a meeting in December. So what we're asking you to do, we'll provide all the meat, probably smoked turkey and ham, and bring a vegetable or a dessert, and we'll celebrate. And we'll talk about our 50 years, and hopefully we'll get Julie back then, who served the longest chair for 15 years, and they did some remarkable things while she was in charge. The chair report, I just list things that I do, but Bunny and I could list a whole bunch of stuff. There is a correction there, Bunny. It's Allie Burton, not Button, on that as we go further down. But y'all don't need to have me read what my report was and what I did. Let's go to the treasurer's report. Stan, will you let us know where we're at?
Well, of course, we're starting our fiscal year in October, but we ended our fiscal year of last year with only $37 left over. So we really spent our money very well. This is our best ever that I can remember in utilizing the resources the county gives us. So Barbara, thank you for what you did last year.
Yeah, well, I'm thankful to the executive committee. We meet 4 times a year, but we kind of in the summer hammer out kind of vision what expenses for the next year, and we've really tried to be partnering with Heart of the Hills Heritage Center. We've already already made a commitment in the budget to be supportive of an exhibit when they open in April. Don Frazier's on the committee, but Kerr County Historical Commission is going to be a major financial sponsor in that. So we put that in our budget so we can plan, so then we can be good partners. And I'm looking at Linda Stone. She's a powerful mover on that committee for developing that temporary exhibit. She wears 2 hats. She wears a hat being on the board of the Heritage Center and also at the Historical Commission. Christopher, thanks again.
Of course.
It was wonderful. Appreciate it. And I'm grateful that Stan reminds me, we're not flippantly spending money, but we don't want to give money back. We have a very tiny budget and we want to use it wisely, and we know there's a lot of ways that we can work to preserve and promote and protect history. So we want to use that money. I'll move to the committee reports. The Archaeology Association, they have a big meeting November 15th, and that will also be here. That's always open to the public. If you didn't know, part of the reason we did the program on Fort McKavett and archaeology is that the Texas Historical Commission really promotes this Texas Archaeology Month, and so there's lots of things going on. I don't think Carrie Pruitt is here today. She isn't, but she is organizing a Mountain View Cemetery cleanup. If you do not know where that cemetery is, it's the corner of Sidney Baker North and Holdsworth Drive. They really want volunteers for this, bring gloves. They'll have other things, but Wright's Funeral Parlor is supporting that. Part of our role as a historical commission is oversight of our cemeteries, and this is a great initiative that we didn't start, but we'd like to provide volunteers to really have oversight over these kind of neglected cemeteries. I'll put a plug in here for one of our members, Monica Clayton, who's now begun work on the Tivy Mountain Cemetery to get a marker. Rose Lavender, back in 1975, started a project with her high schoolers and did a lot of legwork on this, and she's on the committee with the rest of us to work to kind of get this story told, but also do cleanup. And if you didn't know, many of our earliest Black families are buried there. It has a great history, so that's going on under cemeteries. Bunny, will you talk about what you presented at the Commissioner's Court a little bit as committee, what went on there? And
well, it was a really, it was basically the report that you all received in your email. That I sent that, so it's part of the official agenda for the county, those 2 pages, and the judge likes these 3 to 5 minute reports, and Linda Stone came to support me. Noel Putnam, our second vice chair, was there. I think I did pretty good. I think I was under 5 minutes.
You did excellent.
Because they had a long agenda last Tuesday. And so they voted to accept the report on the 50th anniversary.
I just wanted to really thank Bunny, stood in for me there because I had a doctor's appointment in San Antonio, and I know she did a marvelous job. I heard from a lot of people. So, you know, because she was tooting our horn, telling our story. That's important to do. I'll move to exhibits. Jeff Holt asked us a while back after the Letters Home exhibit to help produce a permanent exhibit for the Allie Burton Annex. The name's already on the building. And so Linda Stone and I are working, and I see Allie again this afternoon. And so he's resistant to maybe giving up his display of things that will go in the cabinet. And I understand that at 101 he probably wants to hold on that. But we will do some boards and tell his story as you walk in. The entire public is invited. I encourage y'all on Veterans Day, November 11th at 3 p.m. to be at the Allie Burton Annex, because that'll be a great showing. The VSO, Veteran Service Office, is doing a lot of work, and he's 101. He'll be 102 in January, and he's got a remarkable life story. To keep you up.
Name should be added to that exhibit.
Absolutely, because Bunny's doing the editing
Yes.
from my writing always. Yeah, always. I'll go to historical markers. We have 2 approved that are in the works. I can't even get into my frustration with how long these take, but we are staying at it with the Texas Historical Commission to get those done. The good news is we were called by the Texas Department of Transportation and we recovered Sherman's Mill. That was one of our lost markers. It is usable, and they will let us know when that will be placed again. They will be handling that for us. We did not find the hunt. We are asking, they sent us to FEMA first, the state did, to try to get funding, and was a dead end. We are going to go through private funding to try to replace that one and possibly put up another marker in the hunt area. They're going to have a memorial park that will memorialize, the flood that occurred July 4th, 2025. So those things are working, and TDOT is still looking for a missing marker, but I suspect that one's probably very deeply buried. Leroy, you want to say anything about membership? You don't have to, but if you want to.
Just my standard comment, that is if you remember, you'll drop your name tag off in the basket as you leave, it'll be there next month for you.
I'm gonna say this about membership and what we're moving to do. One of the things the Texas Historical Commission asks, it's the first question on the annual report I have to do. They want to know how often we meet quorum. And you figure out a quorum, so we have listed 66 members, and look how many of us are here that are members. We never make quorum. It's not that we're not an active historical commission, but they rate this very high. And I'm telling you this, I know Julie tried to work on it a few years ago. We are probably going to move through our membership roles. If you have not been at a meeting in 2 years or participated in any of our meetings or anything, you'll be moved to a emeritus status. That means you just won't be able to vote on anything. You'll still be listed. I'm looking at Leroy. You'll be listed, but you will not be part of the voting part. So we would probably make quorum almost every month. But I think we're getting a real hit because we don't, and it looks like, and we do have a lot of members. Many historical commissions have 14 total members. I mean, they have and we do have a small group of people here doing the work. We know that. But that is coming, and that'll probably be, by the start of the year when we're bringing new people in. I don't have any old business. Is there any old business from the floor, Bunny?
Sorry, I have an item actually under committee report. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand before. Angela could not be here today to give a report on the Heritage Center. So she wanted me to say 3 things. The completion scheduled in November is for the elevator, and the back fence should be installed by November the 14th. They are going to do a walkthrough the week of November the 17th. And one of the current initiatives is to request an estimate to paint the exterior of the carriage house. Because it's that it's not an awful pink color, but as you know, the carriage house sits at the back. And I had asked Angela some time ago if the monies to do the complete renovation included anything about the carriage house. And so I'm glad to know that it at least includes paint. Now, Bill may know more, you're the chair, is there something you'd like to add?
No, I think you're doing fine. Us getting the keys has been delayed because of transport time for some of the materials and so forth. So it looks like we will not have a Christmas party, probably a first of the year party. Show people the house.
Great. Good news. Thank you.
All right. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas do have their meeting. That's October 27th at 10 a.m. And that's going to be on Buffalo Soldiers. And Clifton Pfeiffer will be the presenter. So I'm sure that that will be good. I jumped backwards. So then now I'm at old business. I don't have any old business, but new business. I want y'all to know that the nominating committee in November will come forth. We've got 2 spots that are open. And we're going to be doing some shifting of officers and hopefully bringing on somebody new. That'll come to you in November. We're developing a new logo by the end of the year. We're hoping to present that to y'all. And I am going to send around a sign-up sheet. Don't y'all love sign-up sheets? You can't go until the first thing is a business expo. That's October 31st. We'll have a table there. That'll be 5 to 7. Friday night, they're doing first Friday wine share, although it's not the first Friday. But the next day, 10 to 3. And we could use some help sitting at that table on Saturday. I think we have Friday covered. But it doesn't matter. If you want to come, sign up. I put down here those interested in executive committee positions or other committee heads. Please put your name down there because the nominating committee is working now. And then I put a potluck. So if you think you know what you might want to bring to a potluck, I'm going to even give you my pencil. And I want nobody gets out of here till your name is on somewhere. Just kidding. Just kidding.
Doors are locked.
Just
Technically, my name was already submitted on there, if you remember. On the expo.
what's your name submitted?
Yeah,
Tell me.
I told you.
Well, cousin, I just have to say, if you tell me something, you cannot possibly expect me to remember it. You have to write that down. So it'll go around, and if I actually need to get you something to write on, Don. So if you have an hour and you would like to be, basically, we do the expo because that's where we can really engage with a lot of people. They've had as many as 4,000 people go through there. Part of our Chotsky or giveaway or whatever is, and Linda Stone pulled a bunch of these out. We have some beautiful old black and white photos of the Guadalupe River at a beautiful time in memory from the 50s, water skiing. And so I had postcards made out of those. And we'll be giving some of those away and some pins and some other things. You know what they're really interested in, though, especially on wine night, is they're interested in stuff to eat. So I still have to figure out what kind of giveaway we can because they'll walk around and they're looking for food. And we didn't do so well the first year because we didn't have any food. But does anybody else have anything else from the floor they'd like to share? Questions? Patricia?
Christopher left a card with a QR code, and it would be helpful for him if anybody has on their phone and to fill out a survey on how he did, because he's rated by Fort McKavett, and he gave up his day off to be with us today.
Oh, gosh,
So
yes.
if anybody can do that, that would be lovely.
Yeah, I thought he was excellent.
Yes.
And I didn't realize he was Jane's grandson. So anyway,
Mark and I went on the Kerr Arts and Cultural Center's Ghost Murder and Mayhem walk from Friday and Saturday night to we left last weekend, and it was lots of fun. So it's just you meet at KACC, it takes about an hour, and it's just a walk up and down Earl Garrett, kind of over to Pantel's and back.
is Lonza telling the story?
No, she had a guy named Kevin, a new volunteer who's
Okay.
moved to Kerrville. His mom's lived here for 35 years, and he's now here helping her, and he volunteered to do that, and he did a very good job, and we learned some stuff, and we taught him some stuff, and it was just fun.
That's
and
great.
To support what she's doing out there.
That's great. Lonza has a lot of things going. This Smithsonian exhibit that's coming in May, that's going to be lots of fun. And I know Linda and I are sitting on that committee to try to be helpful with the Sparks of Innovation, but she's wearing a whole lot of hats. I'd be remiss if I didn't end by saying lost a few people near and dear to our hearts, some of them members, and Julius lost his brother Marvin, our cousin, and he sure is missed. But Laura Lynn Pfeiffer Rhodes passed September 13th. Linda Gay Jones Brown Stevens passed June 17th. And Terry Jean Rial Wallace, so she was another cousin of ours, And so we miss them, but we're grateful for their lives and what they've done. Okay, thank y'all for signing up, and until next month, please come and we'll celebrate and just talk about what 50 years been like at the Historical Commission, and we'll share a little Thanksgiving meal. And we used to do that a lot, but then that died off, and so anyway, and we don't meet in December because December's busy enough. Okay, all right, thank y'all.